Hello and good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much again for joining us for a next installation talking with Geert Vanden Bossche. And we also have Dr. Rob Rennebohm as well with us. Now, listen, I have had the tremendous privilege of talking to Geert probably the most, more than anyone else, because I've had probably 6 or 7 interviews with Geert. And all I can tell you is that his thinking and his application of science is second to none. And this is why I trusted then what he said and still trust what he's likely to say now. We've got as well, Dr. Rob Rennebohm has been working diligently looking at Gert's research for quite a while, over a year. I've interviewed him a year ago, and he's focused on looking at it and applying his clinical knowledge to be able to bring the science together. So it's with great pleasure that I have with me both Gert and Rob. How are you all doing at the moment?
You're fine.
Excellent. Excellent. So I'll just start off with you again, Gert. I'll ask you to do a quick introduction, and then I'll ask Rob to do the same.
Okay, well, first of all, Philip, thanks for having me and also Rob again on this show. My background is veterinary medicine, and after a few years of clinical practice, I switched to virology, specialized in virology, molecular biology, immunology. Stayed for a number of years well, about 10 years in academia, and then moved on to the vaccine industry, where I worked as well in late development as in early development, so a research department where I was responsible primarily for heading up the adjuvant platform and also the platform on alternative delivery technologies. So this was primarily my function with three major pharmaceutical companies, vaccine companies. And after another 15 years about, or a little bit less, with industry, I changed to the global health industry, worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in Seattle, where I was a senior program officer, basically scrutinizing all the proposals that brilliant people were submitting to the foundation to get grants on new vaccine technologies. And I also worked for the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization in Geneva, so Gavi, where I was the Ebola program manager a number of years ago, I think 6, 7 years ago, when the Ebola crisis hit West Africa. And well, in parallel, I was also doing consultancy, working on a new platform based on natural killer cell-based vaccines. So I felt I was pretty well prepared when the pandemic hit. And well, since I would say 2020 approximately, I focused entirely on analyzing the pandemic, especially from the evolutionary viewpoint, so the evolutionary dynamics of both the virus and the immune system. Over.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much, Gert. And Rob, tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Well, I'm a pediatrician and a pediatric rheumatologist. Rheumatology focuses on autoimmune diseases and study of the immune system. I've been a pediatrician for over 50 years and a pediatric rheumatologist for 43 years. I spent the bulk of my career as chief of the pediatric rheumatology service at Nationwide Children's Hospital at Ohio State University. Before that, I was at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. After that, I was at Alberta Children's Hospital in Canada. And then I finished my career up at the Cleveland Clinic, where I primarily focused on a very rare autoimmune disease called Susac syndrome. And I officially retired in 2018, but for the past 3 years, I've been a spending full time really studying and writing about the COVID situation, because I realized that these COVID issues are extremely complex. And I also realized that practicing physicians have really not had much time to study and do the homework that's necessary to understand what's going on with the pandemic. So
Excellent.
that's what I've been focusing on more recently.
Excellent. Yeah. So it brings us to, I guess, an important starting point, Gert, which is that when you first started, and we had our first interview in March 2021, and you were quite confident then that there was a grave danger with regards to mass vaccinations across the world. Has anything happened that would temper your view then as to what you think now?
The answer is very clear, Philippe. Absolutely not. I have explained in my book, because that is what people are saying. Of course, yeah, Geert, you were announcing kind of catastrophe, and it didn't happen. And I realized studying in depth this complex phenomenon, as Rob was just saying, that I had been neglecting, in fact, a very important aspect, immunological aspect, by which, in fact, the immune system was capable of delaying the immune escape phenomenon. And so that is why, in fact, the timeline for what I have been predicting with certainty, for me at least, was delayed, but the outcome is still exactly the same.
Mm. I wanted to bring in Rob here on a question, and it's tied to what you had said, and I'm basing this from observing comments on YouTube, on elsewhere. A lot of people are very upset with the scientific and the medical community for not raising questions and and not asking questions, it appears. What is your thought about that? And would you have been different if you were working actively at the time now?
Well, I think a very fundamental principle of science and medicine is that all plausible hypotheses need to be welcomed and strongly considered. And the way to do that is to have a thoughtful, respectful, science-based dialogue amongst scientists and physicians to evaluate those hypotheses. And and I think to a great extent that hasn't happened. There's been largely silence regarding Geert's analysis and the concerns that he has expressed, and the hypotheses that he's offered, and the conclusions that he has offered. So I have always felt strongly that it's very important to take analyses like Geert's extremely seriously, and at least subject them to careful dialogue. And I think in Geert's case, his analysis has been extremely important and extremely valuable. And I think it's been based on a very deep understanding of immunology and virology and vaccinology and evolutionary biology and all of the fields that need to be considered when we evaluate this pandemic, and particularly when we evaluate the issue of whether our interventions with these vaccines might have an adverse effect on the course of the pandemic and have consequences. So I have felt very strongly that it's important to take excellent analyses like Geert's very seriously and act on them. And I feel very strongly that patients and physicians and the public at large deserves to know about Geert's concerns in detail, and they deserve to have some help in understanding what he's talking about and what he's concerned about, and why he is so worried. Patients deserve to be informed of his analysis so that they can plan in advance in case he's correct. We owe that to patients and their physicians and the public at large. Now, there can be considerable disagreement as to how certain we can be that Geert's predictions will or will not come true. Geert feels very strongly on very sound bases, scientifically, that his worries are very valid, and he's extremely worried that his predictions will come true. Other scientists may disagree. They might think, well, there's a 50-50 chance that what Geert is talking about might happen. Others might say, well, maybe a 25% chance. Others might deny that there's any chance of that happening at all. Personally, my own conclusion is that I think there's enough information available, thanks largely to Geert, to be very concerned. And the likelihood of a worrisome variant emerging, I think, is sufficiently great to warrant our making the effort to plan in advance for that possibility. I would rather people not be caught by surprise and then panic and have no proactive plan for how they're going to deal with such a virulent variant. I would rather that they be informed in advance, that they have a chance to meet with their physicians and work out a plan of action in case what Geert is predicting actually happens. And that's going to require some advanced effort. Yeah. And it certainly starts with informing people of the possibility. So in my view, even if you don't think this is more than a 50-50 chance, even if you disagree with Geert's level of certainty on this, at the very least, we need to discuss these issues, and we need to at least strongly consider proactive anticipatory planning.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's what we call a SWOT analysis. These are the threats when you look at it from that point of view. So, Geert, when let's just go into where you at the moment feel things are likely to go. What really do you think is likely to happen next? Because the WHO has said the pandemic is over. This has technically now become an endemic cold. Why would you still be concerned?
Yeah, well, Philip, it starts, in fact, indeed, with scrutinizing this type of statements, which, frankly speaking, I cannot understand. But knowing that the top management of the WHO is completely scientifically incompetent, I'm nevertheless not surprised about this stupid statement. Because everyone can see that with regard to the pandemic, well, first of all, it's very clear that we have no sterilizing immunity. That's very clear. So at an individual level, that means that you will still have a significant amount of symptomatic infections. At an individual level. Is that what we are seeing? Yes, that is what we are seeing. We still have considerable amount of symptomatic infection. At the population level, this would mean that you don't have herd immunity, right? So practically speaking, that would mean that the transmission of the virus is not under control. Is the transmission of the virus under control? No, the transmission of the virus is not under control. On top of this, it's also very, very clear that the virus continues to evolve. So the virus has already been evolving from no longer being, neutralizable to being, more infectious and even in vitro more virulent. So the virus is clearly still evolving. All this goes completely against the idea or the concept of the pandemic being over. And so that's where it starts. If the pandemic is not over, if the virus continues to evolve, if there are still some symptomatic infections, and if the transmission is still going on, the next question is, of course, where is this going? And depending on your next question, Philip, I will just tell you that for me, it is very, very clear that the virus has now engaged in the last straight line to increasing its virulence. And you can, and it's a quite slow process, but what we can see compared to the previous observations with the pre-Omicron variants and even with the early Omicron variants is that the infectivity of the virus is no longer dramatically increasing. So it seems like that kind of potential of the virus has been exhausted, right? So, but the virus can still replicate. We don't control the virus. Parties, pro-vax, anti-vax, etc., are trying to control each other, right? But nobody's controlling the virus, and nobody seems to care about this, right? And that is what I'm very, very worried about, because based on the molecular principles and immunological insights that I've described in my book, for me, there is absolutely no doubt that the prevention of severe disease that is right now, according to my understanding, conditioned by non-neutralizing antibodies will completely wane, and that as we have seen for Omicron, remember, Omicron came all of a sudden, for many people out of the blue, completely unexpected, very suddenly, that we will very suddenly see a steep increase in hospitalizations and severe disease. And by the way, in some countries, we are already seeing that these rates are picking up again, that they are increasing, right? So all this may be, sufficient as a first answer to your question, why am I worried, and what I'm thinking is going on with the virus right now. I'm thinking just about the virus. I think that the rest of the world is simply focusing on the wrong thing right now. The thing to focus upon is the evolution of the virus, because if that doesn't go the right way, it will affect all of us, right? So that is something that I think doesn't gain enough attention right now, because people think, Philip, I would be the best proponent of defending the narrative. Guys, what are you worried about? Hospitalization rates, severe disease, mortality, it's all under control. Measures have been relaxed. The spread of the virus has diminished. So we are entering into a phase of endemicity. No, we are entering in a phase of disastrous immune escape. That is my conclusion and interpretation.
Yeah. So Rob, I want you, because of your wonderful pediatric expertise as well, I want you to, what you've heard there with Geert, imagine explaining that again in a very simple way. What is he really? I mean, just in case some people didn't get it, I think that I want you to just say it again in a quick summary. Can you do that?
Well, that's what I've tried to do in my video presentation. This is a very complex situation, but I think what Geert is saying is that we are experiencing a calm before the storm. It's a reassuring calm. I think he's pointing out that those who think the pandemic is subsiding and heading into endemicity, because the virus seems to be becoming milder and milder and less of a threat. I think what they are missing, Geert is saying, is that they don't realize that our immune system, in a variety of ways, and in three main ways that Geert has highlighted in his book, the immune system has been protecting us over these, particularly during the Omicron era. It has figured out some mechanisms that protect us to a certain degree from severe disease. But what he's saying is that those protective mechanisms will ultimately fail. The virus will ultimately overcome those protective mechanisms. And the biggest threat is that the virus will overcome the protection against virulence of the disease. One thing that Geert explains in great detail is that the non-neutralizing antibodies that the vaccine induces do have a virulence inhibiting effect. They can protect us from infection in the lower respiratory tract, or severe infection in the lower respiratory tract. But what he's saying is that the virus ultimately is going to be able to overcome that virulence inhibiting effect of the non-neutralizing antibodies. And when that happens, we will no longer have that protection.
So, yeah, so it's pausing you on that there, Geert, and just bringing back Geert to this question. In everything, as Rob was saying earlier, there is percentages, 75, 50. If you were to pick a percentage, Geert, when you think of that transition, where would you put it? Is this a medium risk, low risk, high risk, inevitable?
Well, as you know, Philip, I'm 200% convinced of this, and we can do a little bit of a scientific reasoning, and I will go slowly in order for your audience to capture this. If that's not sufficient, I'm sure that Rob can help. But I think we all agree that the immune system, population immunity right now is giving the virus a difficult time. We were just saying, spread has diminished. There is less, there is still, a reasonable amount of protection against severe disease, even against disease, etc. So that is very, very difficult for the virus. So the only thing the virus can do is, so to say, become more infectious. But as I was just pointing out, I think that level of infectiousness, when you see, it dramatically increased, of course, with Omicron. Then we had late Omicron variants where the infectivity still increased a little bit, but now it has kind of reached a plateau. So the question is, what is the virus going to do now to ensure its continued propagation in the context and on a background of an immune response that makes its life very, very difficult? The only way the virus can solve this at this point is by enhancing the transmission. So that means that viral clearance, so that is killing of virus-infected cells, that this clearance needs to be diminished. How can that happen? Could this happen? Well, you have to know, I am describing this in my book, that an important mechanism for viral clearance is non-neutralizing antibodies attaching to the virus and enhancing its uptake by antigen-presenting cells that induce cytolytic T cells. The cytolytic T cells are the killer cells that can destroy virus-infected cells. So that killer function is right now pretty strong. That is the reason why we see less spread of the virus. That is also the reason why, imagine, a large part of the vaccinated population is now even protected against disease. So how can this be diminished? This can only be diminished if the non-neutralizing vaccine-induced antibodies diminish. Then the virus will be less easily taken up by these antigen-presenting cells to activate the cytolytic T cells. But when this happens, automatically, and I'm also explaining this in my book, the non-neutralizing antibodies that are right now inhibiting virulence will also diminish. These two phenomena are intrinsically connected. So the diminishment of the vaccine-induced antibodies that used to neutralize the virus is intrinsically linked to diminished activation of non-neutralizing antibodies, the polyreactive antibodies. But, so when this is linked, automatically, this means that the virulence inhibiting effect will disappear because the polyreactive non-neutralizing antibodies are the antibodies that are right now protecting vaccinees against severe disease. So the question is, are the vaccine-induced antibody titers right now diminishing? I am not aware of a survey of a whole population to monitor this and see on average whether these titers have diminished. What I do know is that neither the recurrent infections with the circulating virus nor booster vaccinations can still boost these vaccine-induced antibodies. So they must decline. I'm sure that they are declining. When they decline, automatically, the virulence inhibiting effect of the polyreactive non-neutralizing antibodies will diminish as well. And that is how diminished titers of vaccine-induced potentially neutralizing antibodies is intrinsically linked to a gradual decrease in the titers of the virulence inhibiting antibodies, and therefore is going to make it more easy for the virus to select immune escape variants that will completely escape to this inhibiting effect. And that is where we will have the enhanced virulence.
I want to ask a question here because sometimes I'm observing the comments people are making, and this one here jumped out at me, and I'll put this here. This is not the only virus in the world. Why is this not occurring with the other viruses that are circulating, the RSV, the influenzas, and so on? Why is this concern primarily with that COVID-19 coronavirus? I thought that was a good question. Any thoughts on it?
Well, it's not a thought. It is not limited. If you want, Philip, it has nothing to do with coronavirus. It has to do, for God's sake, with us, doing mass vaccination during a pandemic and driving immune escape. Remember, all these evolutions that we are seeing right now at the population level have started when we, implemented the mass vaccination program, where we have seen, for example, the Omicrons, where we have seen the early variants, where we have seen the later variants that were directed against other epitopes. Remember, the antibody responses, the immune responses induced by Omicron did not boost the vaccine responses, and these antibody responses were no longer protective, even not against the new Omicron variants. So that is where the shift in the focusing of the immune response took place. And this is how the virus continued to evolve till we had these higher infectious strains like the XBBs and the BQs, etc., and where in fact the virulence inhibiting effect all of a sudden appeared. This is a phenomenon that we have not seen. Would you do the same thing with influenza, you would get exactly to the same data. This does not apply to all viruses. It would apply to all pandemics of acute self-limiting viral infections, where we would do this type of vaccination, mass vaccination, whole populations during a pandemic. So corona is just one of the examples of an acute self-limiting infection.
Yes, Robert. Yes, go ahead, Rob. I was just
So,
going to bring you in. Yeah.
if I may, a couple of things that you just said, Geert, might be confusing to some of the viewers. On the one hand, I think you were saying that eventually the non-neutralizing antibodies that have a virulence inhibiting effect will eventually wane and decrease.
Yes.
Particularly, I imagine, if fewer and fewer people get vaccinated and boosted. And so you said that on that basis alone, those people that have had those protective antibodies will lose that protection or will have much less protection from that. And on that basis alone, they will be vulnerable to more severe infection. But on the other hand, you also said, and have said in the past, that the virus itself will overcome those virulence inhibiting antibodies by developing a glycosylation change that will allow them to overcome or bypass that particular virulence inhibiting effect of those antibodies. So those are two different mechanisms for why people will become more severely ill. But one other point.
These are not two different mechanisms, but go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, these are not two different mechanisms, because when you diminish the level and the concentration of these antibodies, you will make it easier for an appropriate mutant to get selected and overcome this increased immune selection pressure. Remember, this is the same thing that we have at the beginning of the pandemic. We started vaccinating people. The levels of the antibodies and the maturity of these antibodies was not sufficient to really stop the transmission. And because of these suboptimal levels, we were putting immune selection pressure on the virus. Here, when the titers decline of the virus inhibiting antibodies, we will put suboptimal pressure on the virus. And as I was saying, the virus can no longer overcome this with enhanced infectivity. That potential is kind of like exhausted. So it is now most likely, according to my humble opinion, going to make changes in the glycosylation to do that job. And unfortunately, everybody continues doing the profiling of the peptides and the amino acid mutations, etc. What I would like to see is, of the variants that are now circulating, the evolution of the glycosylation profile, the O-glycosylation sites, to see whether and how strongly this is evolving.
Well, again, I think the confusion then is that I think a lot of people have the notion that as fewer and fewer people are getting boosted or vaccinated, and as those virulence inhibiting antibodies decline, they have the notion that that will put less immune pressure on the virus, because they understand that if you have a lot of immune pressure on the virus, it will then learn to escape that pressure. And so they're thinking that if those virulence inhibiting antibodies decline, they're thinking that that puts less immune pressure on the virus and thereby makes it less likely that the virus will become more virulent. So
the best opportunities and chances for the virus, you have to see this like this. If the titers of the non-neutralizing antibodies are very high, I mean, there is no way for the virus to move into overcoming this, right? It's under control. The virulence is under control. But the point that people might make, and that is an important point, is, oh, if that is the case, we should get boosted again, we should get revaccinated, because that is going to increase again the titers, and we will again be able to control the virulence of the virus. And there I'm saying, unfortunately, the boosters, the additional vaccination, even with updated Omicron variants, and even the recurrent infections with the circulating virus, do no longer boost the vaccine-induced antibodies, and that is a problem. So, unfortunately, they are going to decline, and I would love to see surveys of the titer of these antibodies done in, a representative amount of people in a certain highly vaccinated population.
So it's the suboptimal level of those virulence inhibiting antibodies that puts immune pressure on the virus.
Exactly.
Okay. So I guess one of the points that's coming through in the comments, as I said, I'm seeing them, is that people are asking, because quite a number of people are unvaccinated, what does that mean for them? Will their immunity, their mucosal immunity, be adequate, even if the virus then becomes more virulent? What does this mean for the evolution for the different groups?
Well, very, very clear. I mean, Philip, you hear me saying that it is all a problem of the immune status of the vaccinees. I repeated this multiple times. It's. I'm certainly not. I've never done this, and on the contrary, I would never discriminate, people because they are vaccinated. But there is one thing that is undeniable. That is that the immune status right now of a thoroughly vaccinated person is completely different from the immune status of an unvaccinated individual. And to your point, so this whole problem, generating non-neutralizing virulence inhibiting antibodies, etc., all these shifts that we have seen in the immune response have not occurred in the unvaccinated. Why not? Because the first line of immune defense, before anything of this adaptive stuff could ever happen, has been so strongly trained and induced sterilizing immunity that this has not happened. So the only thing that could threaten, potentially, but it's not going to be the case, the unvaccinated, is when the virus would become more infectious, because then its strain status may not be sufficient to deal with a virus that is even more infectious than the precedent ones, against which the innate immune system has trained. But as I was saying, this is not happening because the virus has exhausted, obviously, its potential of acute infectivity and is now rather shifting to enhancing transmission by the mechanism that I just explained. So in a nutshell, I've always said it, never said anything else. There is, of course, for a healthy, unvaccinated person, absolutely no problem whatsoever with this, right?
And so where we are now, and one of the questions I want to ask Rob this here, because I struggle to understand why the scientific community is still holding the line and not actually starting to ask the difficult questions. What is stopping them? Is that pride? Is that just the fact that peer-reviewed studies are coming out which discount this and they just can't accept anything else? What is stopping the scientific community from becoming cognizant and at least just thinking about these possible potentials, Rob?
Well, I think physicians need and deserve to have the opportunity to learn from people like Geert. Most physicians do not have a deep understanding of immunology, virology, and vaccinology. most physicians have a relatively superficial understanding of those fields compared to someone like Geert. And so they need the help of someone like Geert. They need to have grand rounds presentations where Geert's analysis is presented, and other experts in the field can tease it apart, challenge it, correct it if they think it needs to be corrected, or explain what they agree with and don't agree with. That kind of dialogue has not occurred during the entire pandemic. In fact, it's been discouraged. And I think that's why physicians have taken the easier route, which is to assume that the prevailing narrative and the supporters of the mass vaccination campaign know what they're doing, have thought it through very thoroughly, and understand it very deeply, and are doing the right thing. And so their obligation is to support that. That's a huge assumption. And that's why taking all hypotheses and all responsible analyses into consideration and debating them is so important in science and medicine. If you do not do that, if you only allow one prevailing understanding and you discourage and even punish any other challenges to it, that's when you get into trouble. So I think that's where we are, and that's why physicians have not learned what Geert has been trying to explain to them. I think Geert would be the first to say that he wishes he could have substantial debate and discussion with other experts in the field, because he's had to pretty much develop this analysis on his own. He hasn't had the benefit of feedback. Well, what about this, Geert? Did you take this into consideration? What about this paper? Are you sure you understand this correctly? I have a different understanding. Let me share it with you. Let's work together and try to figure out the most accurate understanding of what's going on. He hasn't had the benefit of that. He's had to do this pretty much alone. It's very, very complex. So that's, again, why it is so important to have respectful, rigorous dialogue on these issues, and that has not happened. And it's unrealistic to expect physicians who are busily practicing medicine to take the time to learn all of this on their own. Yeah. I think you made the comment earlier, there's mostly retired physicians who have seemed to be taking a deep dive into this pandemic. And that's very true, because even though we're retired, we're still interested, we're still concerned, we still have a physician's mentality, we still believe in patient education, informed consent, and anticipatory guidance. We can't stop having that mentality. And we have the time, fortunately, to take a deep dive into this.
It raises the point, Geert, is that we're 2.5 years into the vaccination part of the pandemic. I think people would have thought by now that some of the colleagues, the experts across the world, would have reached out to have these kinds of conversations. What's going on?
Well, yeah, Philip, what is going on, as Rob was saying, this is very, very complex. And, modesty is important, right? And I think that once people have gotten these big names, right, and this big reputation for some reason, right? I mean, in most cases, but then it seems like everything stops, and also the expansion of their knowledge stops. And I'm really speaking for the vaccine field, because, to put it bluntly, I mean, we have miserably failed in the field of vaccinology. The only thing we are capable of doing is making prophylactic vaccines against acute self-limiting infections. That's 90%. Of course, we have a vaccine against hepatitis B and human papillomavirus, but it's only provided we can administer those vaccines before exposure, that we can capture the virus before it enters into the target cells, that this works. Just like a drug, basically. Just like a drug, right? So there's fundamental, the immune system and the interaction with the pathogen is so complex, and the immune pathogenesis, if it goes beyond neutralizing antibodies, is simply not understood. That is also my conclusion, having seen tons of proposals from, world-renowned scientists, professors, Nobel Prize winners, that submitted their proposals to the Gates Foundation for vaccines. And I had just, to put them in the trash, because it was just, not completely scientifically unreasonable. These people have forgotten that the science nowadays, as Rob was pointing out, for these complex problems is not to be a top virologist or a top immunologist or a top vaccinologist. It's not because you have written a superb book on vaccines that you have the right to talk here. Because if you're not knowledgeable enough about immunology, about evolutionary biology, and so on, then of course it becomes very, very difficult. And I'm not saying that you need to be a top expert. I'm certainly not a top expert in all these fields, but I'm a problem solver. I'm trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. These people are not doing that, and they realize that they cannot explain what is happening right now. Nobody can explain. I challenge them all. What is happening right now? How can you, for God's sake, explain that people are still protected against disease or severe disease when the vaccine-induced antibodies don't even work, right? So come on, there must be something else. Ask them, Philip, what it is that protects people. You will be left with no answer. So the knowledge is simply, and people are feeling very uncomfortable because it is no longer within their field of expertise. They feel something else is going on, but all the certainty, what they want to stick to is their paradigms, right? Their dogmas, etc. And therefore, if people don't open their mind to listen to jerks like myself, right? They don't open their mind. They don't want to think out of the box. They do not accept scientifically plausible, not proven, but plausible hypotheses that are not contradicted by what we are observing. Then we will not make any progress in this field. This is a very conservative field, with people having their opinions carved in stone, feeling protected amongst themselves because they're sticking to the same paradigm. And, it's always the same. When you go against mainstream, right? I mean, you encounter plenty of people who simply saying, well, or they are going to question you on several different elements of the hypothesis. Whereas the hypothesis adds only value if you consider all the different aspects of it. Every single element in its own can, of course, be criticized. But when it fits together in a way that matches the observations, that is scientifically plausible, that does not violate the rules of the disciplines that are involved, and virology, and immunology, and vaccinology, and evolutionary biology, then you have a strong case. But people have not learned this. This is deductive science. People want to go to their lab, do what they're good at, their T cells and their B cells, and draw conclusions based on the few experiments that they have done. This is no longer going to be sufficient to solve complex problems like this one. And that is why we see that there is reticence, that people remain silent. Of course, there is less fact-checking. We see this, right? And, people come with theories like, T cells protect, etc., right? All this kind of, and We are now the ones who need to do the fact checking. Say, guys, I mean, look what's happening. Look really what is happening. This can no longer be explained by the conventional dogmas and paradigms, right? Something else is happening. And if that would ring a bell, we would already be, a huge step, a huge step in the right direction. But, even that is not happening right now.
Yeah. So, Rob, I want you to say, as we prepare, as we're coming towards the close, I want you to put together what you think Gert is saying, and then I'm going to be asking Gert to finish off what his main message would be. So, go ahead and make your point as well, Rob.
Well, I was just going to make the point, going back to the tradition of medicine, which is to have rigorous dialogue about complex issues. If scientists and physicians disagree with Geert and feel his hypotheses are wrong, or he's getting this wrong or that wrong, then it would be very helpful to have a point-by-point explanation of where they think he is wrong, and what their alternative explanation is for this or that point. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. Instead, we've essentially gotten silence, and there has not been this kind of rigorous dialogue. So one of my major suggestions is that we need to have that dialogue.
And that's moving forward. And so, based on where you see Gert talking at the moment, are you also anxious about the future, Rob?
Yes. As I said earlier, I've seen enough and learned enough to be very concerned that we need to take this possible scenario that Geert explains very seriously. There's enough information to suggest that we need to proactively prepare for that possibility. That is in keeping with the practice of anticipatory medicine. So yes, I think Geert's analysis provides plenty of reason to move forward in encouraging patients and physicians and hospitals and health departments to make plans in advance for what can be done to give people the best chance, particularly the most vulnerable. And as Geert has pointed out, the highly vaccinated are more vulnerable than the healthy unvaccinated. But I think for sure we need to encourage proactive planning for how we will deal with this scenario that Geert is very worried, and justifiably so, that might occur.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. And Gert, your final words, advice, thoughts to the audience?
Yeah, well, my final advice is simply to be pragmatic, because I always said, it's not about me, it's not about us, it's really about what the virus is doing and about the message. So for me, the debate, who is wrong, who is right, and explain this point, and we will discuss here and there. For me, frankly speaking, it will come too late, right? And I said, even stopping all the mass vaccination today, it won't help. I have explained this multiple times. With the advent of Omicron, we have achieved a point of no return, simply because Omicron is maintaining, is self-fueling the immune escape, right? So to be pragmatic, for the unvaccinated people, health-wise, there is no issue. I don't see any issue, really. Of course, they should continue living a healthy life. That's very clear. For the vaccinated people, I must strongly advise that when they see that what I'm predicting becomes very manifest, because some people think that the increase that we are seeing right now in some countries in hospitalization rates and severe disease, it's still not worrisome, etc. But if it is going to incline the way I'm predicting it, then it will become obvious for everyone. And then I would really recommend all vaccinated people to take antivirals prophylactically, because what we are going to see, and people can write this down, is fewer cases of long COVID, but more cases of short COVID. And with short, I mean really short, right? So that is my pragmatic advice. Can we do anything else? Will lockdowns, etc.? No, they will not help, because you will look up people who are the source of the problem, right? So that will not help. And secondarily, I was also planning on organizing with the Alliance for Natural Health with Rob Verkerk some masterclasses on pandemics and epidemics, because I really would like to appeal to the younger people, young scientists, young medical doctors, and everyone with an open mind to go through, the several hypotheses, not in order for me to prove them that I'm right, but, for them to encourage them to think deeply about this, so that next time around, or that this next generation is better prepared for a discussion, as Rob was saying, is open, still with a critical mind, but open to listening and to sharing other opinions and insights about such complex problems. I think that really needs to happen, but unfortunately, we will need to start with the upcoming generation. I don't think it's still going to be possible with the current establishment. Over.
Yes. Go
I
ahead,
would
Rob.
emphasize, though, that it's not too late to at least prepare in some way for when and if this more virulent variant appears on the scene. There's a lot of things that people can do individually and collectively to prepare for that eventuality. If it doesn't happen, fine. At least we've made preparatory plans. But certainly, if it does happen, we will look back and be glad that we made some proactive plans.
Excellent. Yes, I've put up the links for both Gert and Rob. So for Gert, it's voiceforscienceandsolidarity.org. And that you can find more information about Gert there. And certainly for the recent presentation as well from Rob, notes from the socialclinic.org would be very valuable to see. And listen, I can only say as we come to the end, for those who want to understand the science, as Rob has so clearly said, everything is about preparation. Even if you disagree with Gert, do the homework, check the threats, put it down as being maybe not so likely. But if you haven't looked at it, and if you haven't addressed it, and if it's not part of that SWOT analysis, I think then that's where governments and institutions would have done a disservice to their population. So again, thank you very, very much, gentlemen. I'm sure I'm going to be having you back again at some point. And let's hope, Gert, let's hope you're wrong. I really,
Of course.
yes, let's hope so. Because if you are right, there'll be nothing good that we'll be saying at that point. But yes, let's keep ourselves educated, keep ourselves informed, and continue to do the research. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Philip.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Philip.
Okay.